I'm Miwa Messer. I'm the producer and host of Poured Over. And also, yeah, so I heard REM for the first time when I was an adolescent. That's what I'm going to own. I grew up outside of Boston, and WFNX radio hit the airwaves in 1983, something like that. And when you live close to a college town, you get lots of cool music like REM. And Peter Ames Carlin is the author of a new biography of the band called The Name of This Band is REM. And Peter, I'm really happy to be here and be able to goof out with you a little bit because, this isn't quite the thing we do on the show all the time.
Excellent. Well, I'm delighted to be here. And this is quite the thing I do all the time. So
Exactly. And it's I was doing some math. So the first time I saw REM was the Reconstruction tour. And Walter Brown Arena, and I can't tell you who the opening act was. And the second time I saw them was the Green Tour in 89, and the Indigo Girls opened for them, but that was at a slightly larger venue. And then I did the math on when those albums came out, and I'm just going to sit here and make a face for a second. So when did REM hit your radar, though? I mean, you've been a music journalist, you've been a pop culture critic, you've written about television. I mean, you have been in this game for a while, and I feel like you and I might have discovered the band around a similar moment.
Not exactly, because I did not grow up in a college town, and I wasn't living, even though when I was in college, I was in Portland, Oregon.
Okay.
And the little radio station we had on our campus was so bizarrely powered that it didn't go out on the air. You had to literally plug your radio into a dormitory electrical system in order to pick up the signal. I have absolutely no idea how that worked, but I can tell you this, nobody listened, including me. So at any rate, it took me a while. I didn't really catch up with those guys until they began to get played on the radio, like the real radio. And so really, honestly, I'm sure I saw them on MTV. I'm sure I saw some of those videos and was, normie enough as a kid in the 80s to be slightly puzzled by it. I was aware of this is hip, this is cool. But it really, when it got to the point where it began to kind of drill itself into my consciousness, probably was around the time, 86, 87, around pageant. And then, of course, I went back and retrofitted and listened to everything. And so, built my collection that way. But there was a little bit of kind of going both ways at the same time.
I gotta say, I really like having this stuff on my phone. I mean, back when I started listening to the band, I started on vinyl, then it moved to cassette. Because, when you grow up in the suburbs and you have your car, you must have the cassettes thrown all over your car. And it was just total chaos. But I remember hearing them, and I'm sure it was a little bit of Murmur, it was a little bit of Fable. I mean, Murmur was definitely the first album I'd heard, but also like South Central Rain. And it was all so fresh and new and insane. And I had never heard anything like that. And I was like, who are these guys? And can I have more? And what do you mean they're from Athens, Georgia? Where is that? It really was a pop culture moment for some of us where it just felt like it was like listening to Nirvana for the first time. It was like listening to Pearl Jam for the first time. You were like, what is happening here? And who are these people and where did they come from?
It was like a bat signal that kind of came through the clouds. And the people who were attuned to it were like, you could sort of see their heads spinning. Like, what is this? Where'd it come from? How do I get more of this? Because it was part of the pop culture, but it was speaking in opposition to the dominant pop culture, which at that time was so crushingly conformist. And so, what we saw on MTV and what was coming across mainstream radio was really, in this kind of awkward, kind of yucky, sort of shiny, flashy moment. When you go back and you think of those early MTV videos with the spandex and the flashing lights and all that, and people, playing unplugged guitars and trying to make it seem as if, it was like, this isn't real. Like, this is phony. Then REM showed up and it was like, this is real. Like, these guys are actual, like, intellectual, smart weirdos who are making music for me and all my weird friends.
When they did do interviews, they would also talk about the books they'd read. And it was like, wait, what?
Yeah, exactly.
What?
Exactly.
It wasn't just the films they saw. It wasn't just because obviously there's a lot of art influence too on some of the stuff they were doing, but it was like, huh?
Yes.
It was
right. Yeah, I know. Like, Peter Buck was and remains such a serious reader. Like, he's constantly, like, you never find him without a book in his hand. And he always, it's interesting, you go back to those interviews all the way back to 1983. And, the one thing he really wants to talk about more than anything is like Flannery O'Connor and
Right.
like whatever he's reading in that moment. And Michael wanted to talk about visual art and what he was seeing in galleries. If you were sort of a intellectual weird kid, there were a lot of different windows through which you could see these guys. And it was all really interesting.
So, how did you end up doing the whole music journalism thing? I should mention, too, you've written biographies of Bruce Springsteen and Paul McCartney and Paul Simon, and you did a history of Warner Music, which at the time was known as Warner Brothers, and also has quite a lot of REM's sort of midlife to end of life catalog. So, how did we get here with you?
I started in daily journalism in the mid 80s and kind of learned the crafts, that way and began to write for magazines and eventually sort of weirdly got a job as a senior writer at People magazine in the mid 90s. And so that was where I began, I think. And I spent like almost the first, 15, 20 years of my career writing about anything but music, though I grew up very deeply involved in music. I come from a musical family. And so very early in life, I was listening to the Beatles when I was 3, and Revolver was the new record. And, so I've sort of experienced it that way. And eventually, but though I kept those things apart in my life until I was at People and I got the opportunity to do a story about Brian Wilson from the Beach Boys, who had been sort of an idol of mine since I was, 13 years old. And I got to meet Brian and I did this profile. And then that became this, my first book about music, which was Catch Away, about Brian Wilson and the Beach Boys. And that just it was like suddenly this moment of clarity, like, I have somehow managed to land where I should be. And from there, just all these other I just began to kind of chase that story of my music heroes and writing about music in this larger kind of cultural, historical, political context, which is what I find super fascinating. And that, led eventually to all these other, to the other books that I did. And then the trail took me to REM, who of course is like the absolute epicenter of that connection between music and art and culture and politics and history. And that was absolutely where my imagination lived. And then when I began to kind of look at the books that had been written about them, one of the things that was interesting to me is that, virtually all, the biographies were all written by British writers, which is fine. I love British writers. If things had been slightly different, I'd be one myself. It's just an accident of geography, really. But then I began to think, like, when I read these books, I'm hearing a lot about music. I'm hearing a lot about recording music and the challenges of being a working musician. What I'm not hearing is how they fit into the larger sort of American grain,
Right.
especially since being from the Deep South and writing about, and thinking about, what our, the drive-by truckers called the duality of the Southern thing. You have both this glorious American history and also this horrifying, American history, of obviously slavery and institutionalized racism. And how do you develop as an intellectual person, as a moral person, as an ethical person within that context? And, geez, that's everything. That's everything I ever want to write about.
Yeah, part of the fun of reading the name of this band is REM is exactly what you're describing. It's like slotting in all of the other pieces, right? I mean, they're coming out of Reagan's America, and this is not necessarily a band that you would expect, right? Like the Beach Boys, I mean, for years, I just sort of thought of them as like, old people music, right? Teenagers, right? Like teenagers.
Right.
But if you think about like what Pet Sounds did as a pop culture moment, right? Or like watching the evolution of Springsteen from like the early stuff to Born to Run and then Born in the USA, and how that later album has been sort of co-opted in ways that certainly Springsteen didn't intend. And McCartney's evolution, obviously, and Paul Simon sort of, I remember when he sort of changed the face of the world with Graceland, right? Like that became, suddenly people were listening to South African music and West African music, and like all of these guys just focusing on how do the stories come together? How do we tell the story? How do we tell a greater story? How do we piece it all together? I just also remember being a teenager thinking this is the coolest thing I've ever heard. But yeah, did it send me down rabbit holes before we had the internet? Yes, it did.
So to me, again, if we're talking about what draws me to writing about music,
Hmm.
it's that type of story. It's like, wait a minute, this isn't just about Simon and
Right.
Garfunkel and Bridge Over Troubled Water. This is about somebody who is living a version of the American story that and telling this story in a way, and setting it to music that people understand in a very visceral way. And REM did that with Southern music and Southern rock and Southern culture, and then American music and culture, and on and on.
And it's so weird because I just don't think of them as a Southern band, even though, Athens, Georgia obviously is the epicenter of a lot of stuff. But, I think of them on a continuum, not just, and I'm going to use an Athens, Georgia based band, but Pylon, obviously. But then
Mm-hmm.
you've got the Throwing Muses and the Pixies and all of the stuff where you're like, oh, I see that line. And then you get to Nirvana and Pearl Jam and you're just like, oh, I see that line. I don't know. It's kind of great to be able to see the evolution because, again, until you hit a certain point in your life as a conscious, person, right? Like you're 6 and you're bopping around to whatever your parents are playing, that's a totally different thing. But then to realize you found this band that kind of makes sense and you're like, who are these weirdos? What is this? This is all great. But the band broke up in 2011 and you're writing about them now, and you and I are taping this in 2024.
Of course. Well, because the music is with us still, and it's still influential. I mean, the interesting thing to me is like Corin Tucker from the band Slater Kinney was a neighbor and friend of mine when I lived in Portland, still a friend, no longer a neighbor. She actually spent a summer in Athens in the early 90s before she went to Evergreen and formed Slater Kinney because she was so enamored of REM. And not like she wanted to meet the guys and become a part of their scene or whatever, but she was just like, that's a cool scene. I need to figure out how a scene like that works so that when I go to my little college in Olympia, Washington, you know, I can be a part of a scene there. And I also think that even when you think of an artist as, massive and, titanic as Taylor Swift, the way that she sort of alters her sound and her image from album to album and makes whatever albums she wants to make whenever she wants to make them with whoever she wants to make them with. I think you can also argue that her career model also sort of descends from what REM was doing because they were so, from the moment they signed their first contract, they never signed a contract that didn't give them complete artistic control. And they never signed a contract with anyone who didn't understand that these guys are going to do what they want to do at all times. And it was like that's a model that didn't really exist, certainly not in the early 80s when they began to do that. I mean, that's not the deal the Beatles signed.
Right.
Eventually these bands became so successful and powerful that, they could do a lot of things their own way. But in terms of being a small band, a regional band, a college band, coming up and saying, no, 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 we're going to do it our way, and it was to the credit of both, IRS Records and then
Hmm.
Warner Brothers Records that the people that ran those companies were like, okay.
I was listening to an earlier interview that you did, and you were talking about how at the time people recognized record labels and what they stood for, right? Like it's book imprints. There are
Mhm.
certain people out there in the world who will be like, oh, well, that's such and such an imprint. Of course, I'll read that, right? Whether it's
Yeah.
narrative nonfiction or literary fiction or what have you, or science, whatever, there are people who connect with imprints on that level. And I remember those days. Like I remember thinking, oh, well, there's the IRS logo. Of course I'm going to listen to that. Or, Warner always felt a little edgy. And then there were other sort of labels where you're like, oh, yeah, that's not going to be for me.
Yeah,
It's
exactly.
wild to think about that because now everything's just on my phone. I'm one of those people with like a 25-hour playlist that I just mess around
Hmm.
with and
Hmm.
rebuild and strip down and do all sorts. But I admittedly it's a weird playlist. But you just pick around in parts of it and then you get the thing you want. So
Yeah, of course. I mean, I that to me, it's like I have like playlists I just call Radio Peter, and I just like throw on, and it's weird obscurities, and
mhm.
it's like, the one Genesis song I really love, and there's a whole new way of experiencing music and and popular art where you can really, in a way, I miss albums, I miss like the importance of song sequencing and the amount of control that artists used to have over how their work was experienced
Mm.
when it came on vinyl and skipping a song, you had to stand up and move the tone arm or fast forward if you had to take. And it was hard, right? Now it's just like, yeah, I don't like this song. I'll have these three. forget those, blah, 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 blah. You make your own albums, really. You make your own world. And that has, both its opportunities and its impoverishments.
It is kind of fun, though. I mean, the band did just put out a remastered sort of new collection. It is really fun. But like, I've been listening to the live from the BBC stuff on Heavy Rotate, and it's all just weird. Like, it's a lot of like Michael Stipe talking in the background. And it's just, to me, it has aged, very nicely. And it's just kind of fun to see them or hear them bouncing sort of on the balls of their feet, as it were, because there was a moment where I was like, these guys are very serious. They're very, maybe that's also adolescence speaking too, right? When you're an adolescent, everything is serious. But to hear them sort of in their 60s playing around, just being like, okay, we're going to have a good goof and we're going to sing songs and have a great time. It's really fun to listen to again.
Yeah. Well, there's that period, when they signed with Warner and they began to make, they had their run of like just insanely popular records, going from Green to Out of Time to Automatic to Monster and all those things. It's like they were one of my favorite parts of the book and of their story is that moment after Green comes out, which is like the biggest album they had. It's their first major label record. They tour the world and play arenas for a year. And they get back to Athens, with no plans and no idea, and no sense of what they're going to do next and no need to do anything next. But what they did was just naturally kind of gravitate to the little workspace they had, above a bar or whatever it was in Athens and began to goof around and just sort of toss out things that they were working on and for their own fun and, enjoyment. And then a few months later, what they had was Out of Time, which was this massive smash. And it's not because they were trying to make a hit record. They were just trying to make music that they loved, that they were enjoying making because they loved one another. They loved their chemistry. They loved the feeling of being together and the art that only they could make when they were together, which is one of the things when people talk about like, well, should they get back together? Should they not? I mean, it's one of the things that it's like, I would completely respect their decision to never get back together and just leave it be. But on the other hand, if those four guys, decide, you know what? I miss us. I miss our chemistry. I miss the feeling I get when we're just sitting in a room with our instruments trying to make something, and it's like, that's art.
Yeah. I had such an emotional sort of connection to the music that I never really thought about, their business acumen, right? Like, I was just like, whatever, please, more records. Thank you so much. But reading the book too, I mean, it was clear that they wanted to be superstars from the start. They knew what they wanted from it. Like the idea that these guys never sold out, right? Like this is right. A thing for some of us of a certain generation. And some of us have held on to it and some of us have not. And some of us just navigated as best we can in our daily lives. But there is that little bit of, well, fight the power. We're not going to do, all of that kind of stuff. But these guys really knew from jump that they wanted to be superstars. And I love that idea because, you could look at them from the outside and be like, oh, look at them in their little Converse and their fluffy hair and all of their, jangly guitars. And isn't that adorable? And it's like, well, actually, they had a plan. And the Copeland brothers were part of this plan. Ian and Miles Copeland, right? So Ian finds them first, starts booking them. And we should probably explain for some folks who the Copeland brothers are. And there's a third brother, in case you didn't realize. But can we talk about those guys for a second?
It's sort of an interesting group of guys because they were three brothers whose father was involved in the CIA, I believe, and they grew up overseas. And they all became like this enormous sort of pop, like not only pop culture, but like indie alternative pop culture kind of, entrepreneurs. And so Miles Copeland was the manager of the band The Police and president and founder of IRS Records, which was like maybe, one of the biggest, most influential indie labels of the 80s. And his brother Stuart was the drummer in The Police, a spectacular percussionist and musician. And then their brother Ian, got involved in concert promotions and booking and, being an agent and formed this agency called, cleverly enough, FBI. And then one of his, signings was R.E.M. And then R.E.M. was signed signed first with IRS. And so it's this very sort of tightly knit, in a way, world. But the bizarre thing is like those guys. I mean, certainly Miles never made any secret of his politics, which were not what you would expect. More what you would expect coming from a guy whose dad was a CIA agent than a guy whose brother is a drummer in a rock band. But on the other hand, there are rockers and there are rockers, and some of them are more progressive than others. But they were very involved with REM, at least until the latter part of the 80s when they ditched for Warner Brothers.
I mean, there's an entire ecosystem, right? Like, I mean, you start and you're doing the small clubs and the small shows and then the college tours, and you're living out of a van, and then stuff is happening, stuff is happening. But it never stopped. They never stopped growing. They never stopped building on what they did before. And the sound, even if I think about, some of the stuff from the early aughts, like the bass sound is there, right? Like, even if there's a little bit of electronica Madonna thing happening, like, you're listening to it. There's no doubt.
If you listen to the set that they performed in, I think, 1999, I think it's on the BBC box set. They went to the Glastonbury Festival in 1999 and played there for the first time. It's that enormous, influential festival in England. And they came out, and it was after Bill Berry had left the band. They were a little bit on their heels because their record, Up, which was the first one without Bill, hadn't done anywhere near as well as the earlier records. And it was a very electronic record. There's not a lot of guitar on it. It's very synthy and strange. But they came out to Glastonbury and they played a jaw-droppingly electric, powerful set. And one of the things that you realize when they start playing live versions of those songs that are so electronic on Up is like, oh no, like these are extremely powerful rock songs, and they're extremely powerful REM songs that were just hidden beneath these kind of synthetic layers. But you get those guys up there when they've got something to prove, and they're just on fire. One of the things when you talk to people who are like your serious kind of original, OG REM fans who go all the way back to the first records, I kind of write about that in the book, and there's this whole chapter about the Murmurers.
Oh yeah, we need to talk about those guys. Because they are mostly men. I will say that they are mostly men.
You're right, exactly. And the people who go, no, they weren't, are, guess what? Men. And God loved men. I'm one of them myself. But nevertheless, it's like that indie scene in the 80s was so overwhelmingly straight, white, cisgender guys, And one thing about which, myself, right? Except for one of the things about us dudes is that especially when you grasp onto something that feels so directed toward you, these indie bands, when you're one of the first people who pick up on these guys and you meet them in the bar and you have a beer with them and you have this, or even if you don't, but you see somebody in a small club and you feel this connection of these are my people. This is my place. I want this to never change and never end. It's like, that's a beautiful feeling to have. And then eventually what happens, especially with a band like REM, who never made a secret of the fact that they wanted to be super successful, which is why while Pylon would only play, this other indie band who were like their model from Athens, they would only ever play places that they thought their people would go to. University towns, cool places that had art scenes, these people would get them. REM from the jump were playing pizza parlors in college towns. They were playing frat houses. They were going everywhere. Their idea was, we're not tuning ourselves toward this specific bandwidth. We're going to say what we want and say it how we want with the music that we want in a way that's going to get all these other people to pay attention to us. And we're going to change hearts and minds through our music. And we're going to go to these people's houses and make them listen to us, which is that's how they began. And that's how they built their whole career. And that's what took them to Warner Brothers Records. It's like, was it a sellout? It's like, no, it was just the next step, in the journey that they were on. And this idea that, and then it's like, why does Out of Time sound so much, sleeker and more powerful than like the sort of shadowy world of Murmur, which is beautiful in its way. But what happened was they became better at writing songs and better at making records. And they learned how to do their jobs a little bit better, which is like, And there's a lot to be said for that kind of enlightened amateurism. Like, I love that type of music too. I love buzzing amps and the sound of people dropping drumsticks in the middle of the take or whatever. Like, that's awesome, right? But that doesn't mean there can't also be great music that's different than that.
I want both.
Exactly. It's such a big garden. There's so many room for different kinds of flowers. And so it's like they began to make these other types of records, but it's like I think Automatic for the People. That's my favorite REM record, like without a doubt. It's dark, it's beautiful, it's complicated, it's elliptical and strange in places.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, that's my art. That's the REM that resonates with me the most intensely.
So I bounce back and forth between Fables of the Reconstruction and sometimes Out of Time. I'm just sort of mentally rolling through like what the spines look like, and I'm like, huh? I don't know. And now that I have this giant playlist, it all sort of comes together and makes sense. And I'm like, which sounds terrible for someone who's been listening to this band for decades. Like literal multiple decades.
Geologic time is what I call it.
Yes. And yes, I'm stealing that because it is geologic time. It's just like, oh, wait a minute. What? Like, I remember my mother talking about the Beatles, and I'm like, oh, okay. The Beatles are not it for me, but apparently I have a similar propensity to talk about REM, like my walker is just over in the corner there. But they did come out of a moment, though, where monoculture was a thing, right? Like everyone watched the same television shows. Cable was kind of starting. MTV was kind of like, you couldn't program your cultural existence the way we can now. Like, I mean, you don't have to see a single thing you don't want to see, right? Mm-hmm. But at the time, like magazines were driving music coverage, like Rolling Stone was a thing. I remember when Vibe was founded, like, I mean, Spin, The Source, all of this stuff. And it's like, oh, right. Magazines were fat. Like you would get these giant issues that wouldn't even fit in your mailbox kind of thing. Mm-hmm. And that was such a huge piece of REM too, was the coverage. I mean, they were even getting covered in the New York Times. I mean, the Village Voice, Krista Gow at The Voice was a huge piece of it too. And like The Voice was a totally different thing. Like, I mean, I remember reading it in college and I would have to go to the library to get it because the school had the copy and you're just like, oh.
Yeah, right.
All of this.
Yeah, it was interesting that the Village Voice played such a huge role in the development, not only of Michael Stipe, but also Peter Buck, who were individually in their own little cow towns in the middle of the country, were like picking up on like and getting massively turned on by not just the stuff that was in the articles, but the ads. The ads, you could learn so much just from looking at like, oh wow, like what movies are playing and who's at the clubs, and then you would just see like what is like bands that just had weird names that were like, wait, what? There's a band called Killing Joke? Like, what does that even mean? I
mean, and again, like I had access I had Newbury Comics in Boston, and that was like, before we had Tower Records, before we had, Virgin, all of that kind of stuff. I mean, you had outposts like that. And, Peter Buck worked at a place like that. I mean,
I grew up in those places. I mean, I used to go, I live in Seattle now. I grew up in Seattle, and I used to spend, by the time I was like 11, 12 years old, I was constantly riding the bus to the U District because that's where all the used record stores were.
Right.
And I can remember like how much of life I picked up just by flipping through record bins or looking at what was behind the counter or I remember a guy in a poster shop who was explaining to me about the artistic evolution of the Beach Boys because I wanted to buy a Beach Boy poster. And he goes, well, you should actually check out. And it was like it just opened up these huge avenues of, what eventually became kind of intellectual exploration. Though at the time, it just seemed like a dumb kid doing dumb kid stuff.
But also that dumb kid stuff didn't mean we could pull out a supercomputer from our pocket and go. I mean, and I'm guilty of this all the time. I will Google things left and right. I whip out.
Oh, yeah, phone. Totally.
And it does take away a little bit of the fun of discovery where it was just like everything was a chase. Right. And you were like, where is this going to lead me? Or like Interview Magazine was always just the weirdest thing you could ever read. If you're in the suburbs of Massachusetts, it's like, what is this? What is going on? All of it. But it felt like the world got bigger every time you chased a piece of the story.
And there was mystery, it's like all you knew about a band was what you could glean from the record. and you'd look at the names on it. I used to pour over liner notes on records. Like I was notorious among my friends, and I had a weird memory so that I could remember like who did the art direction for Jackson Browne records, Gary Burton at Artwork. Like I still know that.
Right. Okay.
And it's just like that kind of stuff. But then you would have to figure out, you would sort of see the connection, like you said earlier. It's like, oh, that's a Warner band,
Right.
Peter Buck. I mean, when I was doing that Warner Brothers book, once
Mm-hmm.
Warner Brothers kind of rebuilt themselves and
Yeah.
became kind of a weirdly mainstream underground label in the late 60s.
Mm-hmm.
People used to go into record stores, and instead of saying what's new this week, they'd say what's new from Warner's this week.
Yeah.
Because that's my type of music. And, but there was so much. If you wanted to know something about a band like REM, you had to chase it down.
Yeah.
Like that wasn't going to come to you in the daily paper, not for the longest time. That wasn't going to come to you on TV, and it wasn't going to come on MTV. You really had to look for it. And the good news was that could lead you to your friends. That's where you could find your community. And so, the world worked in a slightly different way.
A really different way, because David Letterman also was key to a lot of these bands becoming a thing. And now you think of Letterman with the giant beard and, Leno had bands occasionally, and you'd be like, yeah, whatever, fine.
Right, exactly.
I mean, our parents would watch Leno, right? But Letterman, we would sit up in college and be like, so what's happening? Do we need to care about these people? What's their sound? What's going on? And it was that constant, how does this guy? What?
Yeah.
There was a lot of the RCA dog doing the head thing where you're just like, what? What is happening here? How did we get here? And then MTV comes along, and, there was a moment where MTV was doing interesting, weird stuff. Mm-hmm. And then it got really weird and corporate, and then they tried to do interesting, weird stuff again. And now I don't even know if they're on the air. They're certainly not the pop culture youthquake kind of thing that they were sort of in the late 80s, early 90s, and then suddenly it all kind of fell off a cliff. But MTV did kind of matter a little bit.
Oh, yeah.
Michael Stipe was like, I am never lip syncing to a video ever again, go away.
Yeah, until Sinead O'Connor. Well, right, until Sinead O'Connor made Nothing Compares to You.
Right.
And he watched that and he was like, oh, it's like, she's totally lip syncing, but I am into this. Yeah. And it was and what he came to understand is that it's that's just a different kind of performance.
Right.
It's super powerful, and it's not exactly musical, but it's not exactly not musical either, obviously, because she's, but she's having it's so raw and emotional, even though it's on one level kind of fake. But it's this idea, because they made such a big deal from the early part of their career, well, we're never going to lip sync. That's it. Yeah. But then on the other hand, then he sees this, he goes, I think I can do something with this. He's art. He comes out of visual art. So it's oh, I get it. This is visual art. You can do it that way. And it was and then people, of course, your murmurers, the early guys are saying well, what a sellout. It's they're breaking the promises that they made. It's he had an idea, and then he had another idea, and that's how minds work.
But the idea too that you can go to work and play, right? I mean, there are a lot of pieces that you wrote that were probably a little homeworky, and then there were a lot of pieces where you're oh, I'm a bookseller. I get to play. I get to absolutely play with ideas and, voices and all of this kind of stuff where you're this is actually a job. How about that? Okay. And I sort of feel that was always the ethos for them. There are obviously some moments in the book where they're not getting along or something's happening or someone's being an idiot. But for the most part, these guys never lost the joy of doing what they were doing. And even when Bill Berry was I'm kind of good, I don't really want to do this anymore, he's still making music. He's just not doing it publicly. And I think when you love the thing you do, it doesn't matter if you do it publicly or not.
Well, I used to, when I lived in Portland, Peter Buck has lived there for a dozen plus years. And here's what Peter likes to do. Peter likes to play music in bars. And Peter likes to make records. And Peter likes to hang out and play his guitar. And so on any given night in Portland, there's a little tavern in my neighborhood where I used to live called the Laurel Thirst. And for a time, the band that Peter's in with Scott McCoy, who was in the Young Fresh Fellows and kind of the utility musician for REM for the second half of their career. And he and Peter are really tight. The Minus Five would play these happy hour sets on Wednesdays at the Laurel Thirst. So I could just amble down to my local and get a pint of beer and stand there and watch Peter Buck play his Rickenbacker, like from 5 feet away, like close enough to touch him, though that's discouraged. And then he would be carrying his amps. I went to a bar once on a rainy Tuesday night in February. It was a horrible, horrible night, so nobody wanted to come out. And I think the Minus Five, one of Peter's bands, was playing, and there was Peter, and there were more people on stage than there were in the house. And I have never seen a happier looking musician.
Yeah.
Because he was with his friends, they were making music, and what else? What else is there to do?
Hindu love gods. That's what else there is to do. I love that band. I was like, can we have more? Why do we only have one album? Can we have more, please? I mean, that was a side project with Warren Zevon, and there was a cover of Raspberry Beret that it lives on a playlist for me because I love that. I mean, all respect to Prince, but I love that cover. It is just the wackiest, biggest, brassiest thing. And it's one of these like bunch of guys stood around making music and had a really good day, and we get to listen to it whenever we want kind of thing.
One of my favorite things about REM was just the fact that they were lucky in a lot of ways. But one of them was that certainly they came from good families with parents who cared for them. And so they came up with kind of a strong, a lot of artists were fortunate in that way. But one of the things that they did was even when they started their career, they just had, as young men, they had an emotional maturity to care about one another and to put their relationship and their bond ahead of maybe not the music, but certainly ahead of, the commercial part of the game. And the decision they made at the beginning, before they had any credits and any royalties to divide, that because what Peter understood was that bands break up because of money and because of credit. So what we're going to do is we're going to divide both of those things equally from the start. And we won't have anything to fight about. And lo and behold, and they stuck to that all the way through. And I think that a lot of that connection, that caring for one another has made, such a huge difference in their career. And you were talking about how smart they were as business people.
Right.
And really, one of the smartest decisions they made along those same lines was no matter what happens, our office will be in Athens. We are not, and we're gonna pick smart, sympathetic people who we trust to be our manager and our lawyer, and we're gonna stick with them. And they chose very well.
Hey, but I want to talk about you as a writer for a second too, and influences, because you clearly are always looking for the cultural context, and I think that's really important. And not every critic does that. We've all read criticism where we're like, I'm sorry, and in what vacuum are we reading this in? But critics, writers, novelists, playwrights, films, what are the things that sort of created Peter Ames Carlin, the writer that we know now?
As a music writer and as a culture writer, it was Greil Marcus's Mystery Train. I bought that. I was actually looking at my copy of it this morning because I'm writing a thing about like influential music books and I bought that. I noticed I bought it in my college bookstore in the fall term of my sophomore year. And I read that, and it was like, oh, good. I grew up, as a kid reading Rolling Stone. And so I was exposed to some pretty smart writing, even though, I wasn't really aware of what the difference. I mean, I could tell, stories about artists or whatever that were interesting to me. But when it comes to music and art writing, the way that Marcus managed to write about Sly Stone, the band, Randy Newman, in this, but in the context of all of American cultural history. There's a book that I also read that my parents owned when I was a kid called America in Legend, which is like a early 70s kind of like popular texty book type of thing, just about the evolution of American folk culture. The reason I was drawn to it was there's a whole chapter about the Grateful Dead, and it was about the Grateful Dead in the context of 19th century folklore. And so it's like, here's what Casey Jones is. And also here's how the hippie generation and the hippie cultural movement is actually a part of a larger tradition of American eccentrics, what the weird old America. And it was like, Oh, okay. So then I began to see stuff on MTV and elsewhere,
Hmm.
as being part of that. So that was super important to me growing up. And there was a lot of good writing that you could catch up with in Rolling Stone. Dave Marsh was in there, John Landau was in there, and then of course you get like your comic book heroes like Hunter Thompson, who's with a little more hit and miss, but still, or Tom Wolfe. I remember reading the Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test. Like I got dragged into really smart highbrow culture by like wishing I could live in a comic book, about rock and roll.
Here's the thing about good criticism, though. Like, it's a giant education, and sometimes you get
Yeah.
an education in 3,000 words. Like, slightly different. I remember reading Susan Orlean in the Boston Globe, who was a columnist when I was younger, and it's like, and she's gone on to do some pretty interesting stuff. But like, you get a collection like The Bullfighter Checks Her Makeup, and you're just like, wait a minute, what is happening
Yeah.
here? Or Gail Caldwell. I mean, I'm just diving back into newspapers for a second, but like all of these writers that came out of, and they would just tell you a story, and you're like, well, I didn't know I cared about that, but apparently I do.
Right. Or like Joe Didion, for instance. I
Yeah.
mean, a lot of this stuff I would get, like in my early 20s or whatever, when
Hmm.
it was like I really began to pursue like an intellectual education almost starting the day after I graduated from college.
Yeah.
When it stopped being something I kind of had to do and started being something that I got to do.
Right.
And I was trying to teach myself how to be a writer at the time. And so I just started going for like all the great writers, the great books. I mean, Calvin Trillin. I mean, just that kind of literary journalism. Like that was when I connected with that, that was what I wanted to be or aspire to be at any rate. That's what I began to chase. Anything that had that kind of offbeat way of getting into something, that sort of elliptical angle into a story, or the type of writing where you begin to realize that what's happening along the margins or maybe just outside the picture is every bit as maybe even more important than what's happening at the center of the action. So that was, to me, that was the type of stuff that really resonated, and that's the type of thing I really try to get to. I mean, one of the interesting things about REM's story
Hmm.
is and of Athens music, the whole Athens thing, is the enormous importance of the University of Georgia's School of Art, the Lamar Dodd School of Art. The UGA is like full of like Southern fried business majors and football players and that whole thing. But on the other hand, on this one corner of the campus, you've got this bizarre world of Southern eccentrics and weirdos, because they decided at one point, the guy that, Lamar Dodd, who was then running the School of Art, decided he wanted to get a bunch of real artists on the faculty. And he began to hire, like right around the height of the hippie era, just these freaky hippies, from all over. And they came to this little town and created a scene. And they were as into music as anyone. And so their influence, they were a lot of these kids, Michael Stipe, the guys in Pylon, like all these bands that you've heard of, the Love Tractor guys, they all came to Athens to study at the Lamar Dodd School of Art. And that's where they learned a lot about, what they were taught about visual art and how to approach that became an education on how to approach popular music and how to be as eccentric and strange in the context of popular music.
Wait, did the B-52s go through art school there too? Because they're part of the whole Athens scene, and I don't want to overlook them.
Yeah, the Bees came out. I think I'm trying to remember if any of them were actually art students. They were definitely art department adjacent if they weren't there, but I think that they were. I know that Fred was a forestry student.
I love that. I'm sorry. I really, really love that. But like watching the musicality, like there are old clips of them, obviously in Athens, Georgia, Inside Out, which if you haven't seen, go chase it down. But watching the musicality, watching them play, like they're more punk than not. And I remember people thinking, oh, they're this cute party band, and I'm like, they're kind of not. The wigs aside, like this leans closer to punk than, bouncy party music.
There's a common theme among those Athens bands, those early ones like the B-52s and Pylon and Love Tractor, which is like, okay, we're going to be a band. What instrument do you want to play? And it was like, and they would be like, I don't know. It's like Michael Lahusky, who was the bassist in Pylon, and like one of the visionaries in that band, like he and Randy Bewley formed that band. And Michael goes, I want to learn how to play the bass because it has two fewer strings and will be easier to learn. You know, and Bewley sort of sucked it up and tried to figure out how all six strings work. But they were like, they were art students. They were
Right.
or they weren't even sculpt. They won a big sculpting award for sculpture, even though they weren't sculpture students. But that experience, like we can be outsiders and still make something transcendent, was what's that, and the prize money for the sculpture contest was what gave them the money to buy their instruments so that they could form this band. But then when you hear them play, they have a weird musicality that no one else has, which comes from in part because they don't know how to play their instruments as well as everybody else. So they're being super creative and super artistic with their limited set of tools. But what they're coming up with is so cool and so distinctive.
If you're driving through the desert, Chomp is a really good soundtrack to have. I'm just saying, that album holds up. It totally holds up.
Yeah.
Hey, what was the biggest surprise for you when you were writing this book? I mean, I realize you are a working journalist. Not a lot surprises you, but there is slightly different stuff when you're writing on deadline and turning in, X number of words by 4:00 and living with your subject over a couple of years at least. I mean, do you even get surprised? Do you find a thing where you're like, hey, what's happening here?
Oh, all the time. I mean, that's part of the great joy, but it's like, and some of the surprises are more pleasant than others. One of the things that was the sweetest and nicest surprise, what a kind and warm person Michael Stipe is. Not because of any exchange I ever had with him. I've met him, but it was very brief and just kind of, oh, hello, nice to meet you type of situation. But talking to his high school friends, talking to people he's met along the way, I mean, obviously, I think, to have seen R.E.M. be interviewed or him being interviewed in the 80s, there are sort of two Michaels. There's the Michael before he came out and the Michael after he came out. And the Michael before he came out is very he's smart, he's funny, he's pretty defended, and can be super critical and biting of people. But then after he comes out, he becomes like the kindest person. And there's a thing I saw, they were doing some kind of like video interview. It was like a very, very early like AOL.com type of thing. And
all of those chats. Yeah. Oof.
Yeah. And so they're on camera and somebody asked them what they thought of astrology. And Mike Mills says something really biting. He goes, well, there's a reason why it's next to the comic pages. And Michael looks over at him and goes, Mike, that's not very nice. And it was like, oh, it's so sweet. So that kind of surprised me because a lot of times, there's a certain, to be that popular, especially, to be that huge for that long in that type of industry requires a certain degree of ruthlessness.
Yeah.
You got to, every so often, you got to kind of take out the knife, and cut people loose. And so, yes, of course, nobody's perfect. Everybody's done things that they regret or don't regret, which is regrettable. But but what I think is lovely is that there is still, and I think they've all exhibited this, in their own way, in their own time, moments of real kindness and generosity. And you don't always see that in people. I mean, and not in, my business, not in yours. I mean, it's like people, things where it's competitive and a lot, people kind of like feel like they want to do something. And this happens in everyone's business. People have sharp elbows. And, I'm sure there certainly are people who felt hard done by REM, but there are a lot of others who don't.
Have you started working on the next thing? Have you figured out what's next for you?
Oh, yeah. I'm on deadline.
Okay, fair enough. All right.
It's I'm doing a book. It's a deep dive into the making of Born to Run. So it's another Bruce Springsteen book.
Also fun driving music.
Maybe the ultimate driving music.
I kind of do measure, I spent a large chunk of my life in the car. I don't have to do that as much now, but you need your driving music. That's really what it comes down to. Okay, you know what? We could keep going because I'm just a little worried. I'm going to start running down set lists from shows that I have to look up on the internet because, when you're trying to remember stuff you did more than a minute ago, the internet is very helpful. But then I was like, oh, look at those set lists. And we're not going to do that because the name of this band is R.E.M. is out You should just go get Peter's book. Peter, thank you so much for joining us on Poured Over.
Oh, it's been a huge pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening. Poured Over is a Barnes & Noble production. To help other readers find us, please rate and review the show wherever you listen to podcasts.